The Battle of Britain almost changed because of a 2mm mistake, not Germany's mistake, ours. At 5:42 the Luftwaffe sent more than 20 bombers to finish a base they believed was already crippled, and on paper, they were right. Our anti-aircraft guns jammed so often the Germans counted it into their attack plans. But what they didn't know, and what almost no one in the RAF understood, was that a 4-year-old mechanic had found the flaw causing every jam and built a weapon in secret to prove it. A weapon no officer approved. A weapon made from scrap metal in a bicycle crank. A weapon that should have failed instantly, but instead changed the outcome of a raid Germany expected to win easily. If you stay with this story, you'll understand how that too eminent detail turned a doomed morning into a statistical impossibility, and why this moment never appeared in official history. At 5:42 a.m., RAF North shook before anyone saw a single airplane. The tremor moved through concrete, metal, and bone, the signature vibration of Stuka dive bombers dropping into their attack run. Ground crews didn't need visual confirmation. That sound meant one thing. The Luftwaffe expected to hit a defenseless target, and they had every reason to think so. North Wield's anti-aircraft guns had jammed in every major engagement for weeks, 17 to 19 rounds, then total silence while crews fought the feed arm. The Luftwaffe studied that weakness. They banked on it. They planned raids around it. So when more than 20 Hankel bombers and an almost equal number of Bf 109 escorts broke through the morning haze, the Germans assumed the base was already finished. Inside Hangar 2, a 4-year-old mechanic named Elizabeth Carter heard the Stukas before anyone else. She knew the vibration as clearly as she knew the sound of a Merlin engine misfiring. She also knew something the officers didn't. North Weald wasn't defenseless because the RAF lacked guns. It was defenseless because the guns they had were built wrong by 2mm. Carter had spent nights timing jams, measuring ejected casings, and tracking deviations no one else bothered to see. She wasn't a weapons engineer. She wasn't authorized to inspect artillery officially. She wasn't even supposed to be near the anti-aircraft pits, but the numbers didn't lie. Every jam traced back to a tiny misalignment, a margin so small most mechanics would have ignored it. She didn't. And because no one in authority believed her, she did something no one expected. She built her own weapon, not in a lab, not with funding, not with approval. She built it out of scrap she stole from the junk pile behind Hangar 3. 6 cut-down hydraulic tubes, a scavenged Merlin crankshaft, an oak brace ripped from a broken propeller crate, a hand-filed feed assembly polished with sandpaper meant for Spitfire repairs, and a bicycle crank. The result was a 6-barrel rotary gun weighing barely 20 kg lighter than any official AA system, and by military logic far too unstable to fire. But Carter wasn't following military logic. She was following physics, heat dispersion across multiple barrels, rotational balance around a central axis, a 3-feed offset. She discovered through trial and error an angle so precise that a single misalignment could destroy the entire mechanism. No officer cared. No engineer listened to them. She was a mechanic who fixed engines, not someone who solved battlefield problems. But Carter had tested her design in secret. It rotated clean. It fed clean. It didn't jam. Which meant that if a raid hit while the official guns failed, as they always did, her weapon could be the only one on the field that actually worked. That was the part no one else understood. And on August 18th, the Luftwaffe unknowingly handed her the chance to prove it. As the first bombs fell on the south side of the base at 5:44 a.m., shockwaves rolled through the flight line, hurricanes shook in their cradles, metal scaffolding buckled, orders collided in the air. But Carter didn't run to shelter. She ran toward a tarp-covered shape in the southwest anti-aircraft pit, the prototype she'd built alone at night. While the rest of the base slept in shifts, a corporal stared at her, confused, then horrified. She didn't explain. She tore the tarp away, exposing 6 barrels dark against the morning light. The rotary cluster spun perfectly under her thumb. No scrape, no hitch. It was ready. Above her. Hankless opened their bomb bay doors, Messerschmitts tilted into attack angles. The Luftwaffe moved with the confidence of a force that believed the base couldn't fight back. And they were right, except for the one weapon they didn't know existed. The official guns would jam, the crews would fall behind, and the Germans would strike a target they believed mathematically doomed. But battles aren't decided by what the enemy expects. Sometimes they turn on a detail measured in millimeters. Sometimes they turn on someone the institution overlooked. Sometimes they turn on a weapon no one approved, built by a person no one trusted. In 14 minutes, the Luftwaffe would learn that the hard way, and North Weald would survive because of a secret, measured not in firepower, but in 2 mm. The Luftwaffe believed Northfield was an easy target, and in one sense they were right, not because the RAF lacked courage or aircraft, not because Britain didn't have anti-aircraft guns, but because those guns all shared the same hidden flaw, and no one in authority had bothered to measure it. Elizabeth Carter had. For weeks before the raid, she watched the base's QF-3 and guns behave exactly the same way during every engagement. It didn't matter who operated them, veteran crew or newly trained hands. The failure always followed the same pattern. 17 to 19 rounds, jam. 12 to 14 seconds to clear, then another jam, then another. Carter timed every one of them in a small grease-stained notebook she kept hidden inside her coveralls. She wasn't auditing anyone. She was counting lives because every jam meant a bomber flying one step closer to the fuel depot. The hangars, the runways, the control tower. What bothered her wasn't just the jams themselves, it was the consistency of them. Random failures don't follow patterns. Mechanical flaws. Duh. So, while the gunners cursed the equipment and the officers wrote the issue off as combat stress on outdated machinery, Carter did something no one else did. She studied the ejected casings. Every time the guns fired, hot brass flew across the concrete in predictable arcs, except during the moments before a jam. Those casings struck the ground at slightly different angles, slightly different trajectories. A deviation so small, most people wouldn't even see it. Carter measured it. 2 mm. That was the difference between normal rotation and a feed failure. 2 mm that caused heat to build unevenly. 2 mm that pushed the feed arm out of alignment. 2 mm that stopped the gun cold in the middle of a battle. She reported it immediately, not because she wanted credit, but because she assumed any officer hearing the words repeatable, mechanical flaw, would halt operations and fix the problem. Instead, she got the same answer from 3 different ranks. Stay on engines, Carter. Leave the guns to us. She wasn't offended. She was alarmed. Because if the Luftwaffe increased the tempo of their attacks, if they sent larger formations, if they coordinated bomb runs with suppressing fire, then every jam would compound into catastrophe. And that's exactly what happened. Each day, more German aircraft crossed the estuary. Each day, the RAF's guns jammed with mathematical predictability. Each day, the Luftwaffe came closer to estimating the safe windows in which they could dive without risk of counterfire. War isn't just force, it's arithmetic, and the Germans were solving their side of the equation faster than the RAF was solving theirs. Carter finally took her findings to the base engineering staff. She explained the jam pattern, the repetition, the heat map, the deviation in casing trajectories. They smiled politely and told her the guns met specification. She took her notebook to the commanding officer. He listened kindly, too kindly, and told her the matter would be reviewed. It wasn't. The next day, another gun jammed right after the 18th round. 2 men died in the resulting blast radius. That was the moment Carter stopped waiting for permission. She couldn't redesign the official guns. She didn't have access to the blueprints. She wasn't in the right department, and she definitely wasn't on any innovation roster. But she understood rotation. She understood heat. She understood balance. She understood that no weapon can survive misalignment, no matter how well it's built on paper. And she knew one more thing. If a flaw measured in millimeters could doom an entire base, then a correction measured in millimeters could save it. So she did the only thing she could. She ignored the hierarchy, ignored the skepticism, ignored the limitations of her job description, and started building a replacement from the ground up in secret at night, with materials no weapons engineer would ever consider. And with the absolute belief that if she didn't act now, the next Luftwaffe raid wouldn't just damage the base, it would erase it. That belief became the blueprint for the weapon hidden under the tarp. And in the next act, you'll see how Carter solved a problem the RAF hadn't even defined yet, and why the solution came from a place no one in the chain of command ever thought to look. If the RAF wouldn't fix the flaw, Carter would build a weapon without it. The decision wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, it was mechanical. A system that jammed every 19 rounds was a system that would get people killed. And the more she watched the Luftwaffe tighten their attack patterns over the estuary, the clearer the math became. North Wheel didn't need a better crew. It needed a gun that didn't jam, but there was no blueprint for that. Not one the RAF would give her anyway. So Carter created her own. The first night, the idea, inside engine shed 4. Long after the authorized crews had gone to sleep, she pulled out a folder she wasn't supposed to have. Air Ministry file. Multi-arrow weapon experiments restricted. It wasn't classified because it worked. It was classified because none of it worked. Hand-cranked Gatlings from the 1862s, the British Nordenfeldt, the French mitrailleuse that jammed so catastrophically at Gralot, it practically became a cautionary tale. Every design failed for different reasons: weight, heat, recoil, friction, feed, instability. But Carter wasn't discouraged. Engineers learn from successes, mechanics learn from failures, and she'd spent her entire adult life listening to machines more carefully than people listened to her. Night 4, the scrap pile. She went to the junk heap behind Hangar 3. Nothing there was proper weapons grade, but she wasn't building a weapon to spec. She was building something that worked. She pulled 6 lengths of aircraft-grade hydraulic tubing from a pile of damaged components. Stronger than infantry barrels, lighter than steel gun barrels, and most importantly, easy to machine after hours when no one was watching. Next, she found a damaged Merlin crankshaft, a part designed to endure enormous stress at high rotation speeds. She didn't need the whole thing. She needed the central rod. That rod would become the axis. Night 7, the balance problem. 6 barrels around a central rod looks simple. It isn't. If one barrel weighs even a few grams more than the others, rotation becomes unstable. Unstable rotation causes friction. Friction causes heat. Heat causes yams. She cut each barrel to identical length, filed them by hand, weighed them repeatedly on a scale meant for carburetor calibration. When the 6th one matched the first within half a gram, she stopped. That was the first moment she knew the concept might work. Night 11, the collar. The barrels needed to rotate freely. Without perfect alignment, the entire cluster would tear itself apart the moment she cranked it. Official machining tools weren't available. She had a hand file and a workbench light held together with tape. So she carved the rotational collar by feel, slow, deliberate strokes, stopping after every few passes to check the glide. At 217A, after hours of filing, she spun the assembly with her hand. It didn't rattle, it didn't grind, it hummed, smooth even, balanced. A sound more honest than anything she'd heard in the officer briefings. Night 14, the recoil. A multi-arrow rotary gun kicking off recoil through a lightweight frame should have been uncontrollable, but Carter understood shock absorption. She'd spent years repairing the oak braces inside propeller crates, so she built her recoil system from one. A reinforced Browning mount plus a section of aircraft-grade oak equals a brace stronger than steel because it flexed instead of fighting impact. Small detail, huge effect. Night 16. The feed mechanism failure. This nearly ended everything. Every belt she tried kinked Kate under rotational stress. The rounds misaligned, feed angles collapsed. She tried trimming links, widening feed arcs, polishing contact points with sandpaper pulled from a Spitfire repair kit. Nothing worked until she tried something no weapons engineer would ever consider. She fed the belt at a 3 angle. Not 2, not 4, exactly 3. At 3, the belt held its shape. At 3, the rounds aligned. At 3, the feed mechanism survived rotation. She wrote one line in her notebook. 3, the system breathes here. Night 19, the crank. She needed a stable crank system. An official part would have drawn attention, so she took a bicycle crank from the storage shed, ridiculous to everyone but her. Mechanical systems don't care about reputation, they care about torque and balance. The bicycle crank provided both. Night 21, the moment of truth. She set the weapon on an empty bomb trolley, one hand on the crank, one hand steadying the frame. She spun it. The barrels blurred into a perfect rotational ring, smooth, stable, alive, not rattling, not fighting against its own weight. A rotational hum light, balanced, effortless. The sound of something that should not exist, but did. Her throat tightened, not from emotion, but from the shock of hearing a machine exceed the limits its components should have imposed. She had built something coherent out of scrap, and she knew exactly what that meant. The next Luftwaffe raid would come without warning, without permission, without time for officers to approve anything. When that moment arrived, The weapon under the tarp would either prove her right or die in silence, like every idea the chain of command refused to hear. And she was willing to take that risk, because the greater risk was doing nothing. On August 17, 1940, the warning everyone had feared finally came. Radar near Fornes detected a formation of nearly 60 Luftwaffe aircraft heading toward the London defence zone. It was the clearest signal yet. The hardest day was coming. Northfield responded by the book. Crews ran cold tests on the QF guns. Officers checked elevation gears. Technicians pushed ammunition trolleys across the tarmac. And Carter watched all of it with a certainty no one else shared, because she didn't just see preparation, she saw failure points. Gun 1 misfired during a cold test. Gun 2's lubrication was inconsistent. Gun 3's breech had loose casings. 2 other crews reported slow feed cycles. She timed each malfunction. Jam cycle average trees, seconds reload, plus aim recovery, 6 more seconds, total blindness. Newton seconds, 19 seconds in combat, is not time, it's an opening. It's a bomber, releasing a full load. It's a Stuka, completing a dive. It's a base going from functional to burning. She wrote the numbers in her notebook and walked straight to the engineering staff. Her explanation was clear and simple. Your guns will jam in the first minute of combat tomorrow. The lead engineer didn't argue the math. He didn't check her data. He didn't even look at the notebook. He just repeated the same line she'd heard for weeks. Carter, stay on engines. The message underneath was just as clear. This is not your field. But the battlefield didn't care about fields or titles. It cared about results. And the Luftwaffe's results had been improving every day. Carter returned to Engine Shed 4, furious not at the officers, but at the indifference of the system itself. A flaw that repeated this consistently wasn't a mystery. It was an equation, and the RAF was refusing to solve it. At 9:17 a.m., the base conducted a routine gun drill. Everything looked standard until the 18th round. The feed arm jammed again, as if on schedule. A technician cursed and hammered at the breech. Carter didn't intervene. She stood 5 m away and counted. 13 seconds to clear, 4 to reload, 2 to ream, 19 seconds exactly. She closed her notebook. Her paper. Northfield would suffer unnecessary casualties simply because no one honored a measurement. The only solution left was the one she had already built under a tarp in the anti-aircraft pit. So she made a final decision. The next test would not happen in a shed. It would happen in front of the people who doubted her, and it would happen before the Luftwaffe reached the airfield. That night she tightened every bolt on her prototype, rechecked the 3-feed offset, filed the collar until it spun without sound, cleaned each round of ammunition by hand. She wasn't preparing for approval. She was preparing for inevitability, because once the first bombs fell, there wouldn't be time for debate, committees, or signatures. There would only be one question. Does it work? And the only way to answer was to let the weapon speak for itself. At dawn on August 18th, the orders were issued. The prototype would be tested at Shoeburyness Range, not because anyone believed in it, but because the officers needed to settle the matter and move on. If it failed, it would disappear. If it worked, it would still probably disappear. That was how the system operated. But Carter didn't care anymore. Her goal wasn't recognition. Her goal was survival. And if her weapon could survive a controlled test, it might survive the next day's raid. It might save the crews who trusted equipment that betrayed them. It might hold the line long enough to disrupt the Luftwaffe's math. It might buy the base the seconds it never had before. She didn't need permission. She needed proof. And at Shoeburyness, the proof would come louder, cleaner, and more decisive than anything the RAF had ever seen. The officers expected a toy. What they got was a weapon that changed their assumptions in under 3 minutes. At 6:10 a.m., the Shoeburyness test range looked harmless, just grey haze over concrete with technicians stamping their boots against the cold. Nothing about the quiet suggested that a weapon built in a hangar corner was minutes away from outperforming the Royal Air Force. The officers weren't here to evaluate innovation. They were here to eliminate distraction. To them, the prototype was a problem to be dismissed. To Carter, it was the only weapon on the base that might not jam tomorrow. When she walked onto the firing line with 20 kg of scrap and stubbornness slung under her arm, the looks were immediate. Smirks, confusion, skepticism so visible it might as well have been written on their uniforms. one corporal muttered under his breath. "If that thing blows, I hope she's standing closest to it." Carter ignored him. She'd heard far worse behind engine blocks. She set the weapon on the firing stand with practiced efficiency, not a hint of hesitation, not a moment wasted. Her movements weren't dramatic, just clean, correct, precise, the kind of precision the RAF forgot to value until it sat in front of them. She tightened the recoil brace, aligned the barrel cluster, ran her fingers along the feed belt, feeling for imperfections she could detect by touch alone. A worn link, a micro-burr, anything that could sabotage rotation. Nothing escaped her. The officers didn't see that part. They only saw a mechanic checking. This was the phase meant to expose the design as unstable. This was the phase meant to be the end of the distraction. Carter inhaled once, braced her stance, and cranked with everything she had. The weapon exploded into motion. Not exploding physically, exploding in performance. More than 1,000 rounds per minute tore into the armored target. Dust kicked up in waves. Metal shavings sparked off the plates. Noise rolled across the range like a low helicopter blade. The recoil brace groaned but held. The barrel cluster glowed but stayed true. The feed system, meant to be the weak point, ran smoother than anything the range had seen that summer. Technicians scrambled for better angles. Officers covered their ears. One stunned observer blurted, "Why does it run cleaner than the Lewis guns?" No one answered. Because the only true answer was unthinkable. A mechanic had outperformed the RAF's official weapons program alone, at night with scrap. At 6:20 a.m., Carter released the crank. The gun didn't stop. The barrels continued spinning, balanced, effortless, before slowly coasting to stillness. It didn't fail. It simply rested. Silence swallowed the range. The officer, who once called the prototype a toy, stared at the target plate. Penetration grouping near perfect. Impact depth vent above expectations. Feed efficiency novento. Jams 0. He muttered the words he never planned to say. This might actually save the base. Carter didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She didn't even look satisfied. She simply nodded because this wasn't the real test. The real test would come hours later, when 20 Hankel bombers and their escorts dove on north with the confidence of a force expecting no resistance. They were right about the official guns. They were wrong about everything else. The officers at Shubberiness thought the test was the end of the story. They were wrong. It was only the beginning, because just hours later, Northfield faced the exact scenario Carter had warned them about, and the Luftwaffe came expecting an easy kill. 6:10 radar contact. Radar at Foreign picked up a new formation on the eastern horizon. Not a probing run, not a small harassment wave. 20 Hankel bombers, nearly 20 Messerschmitt escorts, a full-scale strike. At 6:11, Northfield received the warning. At 6:12, several Hankels were already opening their bomb bay doors. The base had 3 minutes before the first ordnance hit. Official guns were manned, but the crews were exhausted from the previous day, hands shaking, eyes red, systems unreliable. Carter knew exactly what would happen. The QF guns would jam. The Luftwaffe would walk their attack patterns directly across the airfield, and the casualty list would read like a roll call, unless her prototype held 6116. The first bombs fall. A column of yellow-white flame erupted from the fuel depot. The shockwave lifted debris across the runway and shattered the windows of Hangar 2. Officers yelled, firing coordinates over the den. Ground crews sprinted between shelters. A corporal screamed, "Gun 3 is out, feed jam." Another voice, "Gun, 1 misfire, clearing breach." The base was collapsing exactly as predicted, but in the southwest AA pit, Carter was already in position. The tarp lay discarded behind her, like the shed skin of something dangerous. She didn't wait for orders. She gripped the crank with her right hand, locked the recoil brace into her shoulder, and adjusted elevation with her left. Target angle 19. Wind 7 mph, crosswind from the southwest. Intercept point under 1200 YDs. Her brain did the math before the rest of the base realized the official guns were useless. At 6:17 and 40 seconds, she spun the crank. The barrels roared. Kill 1. 6 hours, 18 minutes and 24 seconds. The tracers rose like a single line drawn across the sky. A Hankel in the center left formation banked slightly. Unaware that anything in this sector could fire accurately, it flew straight into her path. One tracer punched through the left engine cowling. A second tore through an oil line. Black smoke erupted instantly. A bomber fell out of formation, nose down, hit the ridge at 200 mph and detonated. No hesitation, no yam, no misfire. Someone yelled, "What gun is that?" No one answered. Kill 2. 6 hours, 18 minutes and 53 seconds. A Messerschmitt dove directly toward the pit, its MG-37 cannon flashing. Dirt exploded around Carter. A technician dove for cover. Carter didn't move. She pivoted 3 right, the same 3 feet offset she'd discovered in a shed, and fired a focused burst. The tracers sliced across the underside of the fighter's wing. The wing root cracked. Structural failure spread instantly. The plane rolled uncontrollably and smashed into the tree. 2 kills in under 40 seconds. Kill 3, 6 hours, 19 minutes and 32 seconds. 3 Hankels passed low overhead. Bomb doors opened. More ordnance fell across the field. Carter's eyes stung from dust as the ground shook. She didn't wait for vision to recover fully. She fired blind for a full second, based purely on instinct and pattern. A bomber flew through her arc. Sparks ripped across its fuselage. It lost lift and crashed behind a hangar. 3 down. The Luftwaffe's confidence, built on the assumption that this pit was crippled, started to fracture. Kill 4. 6 hours, 20 minutes and 41 seconds. German tactics shifted. The Hankels began staggered descent patterns, a strategy meant to overload gunners by presenting multiple approach angles at once. Carter recalculated on the fly. She increased crank velocity, compensating for heat drag by micro-adjusting grip pressure. Her barrels were glowing red, but the rotation held. A descending Hankel lined up for its run. She fired a force-second-on burst. Impacts stitched from nose to tail. Fuel ignited. The bomber disintegrated mid-air. 4 kills. Kill 5, 6 hours, 21 minutes and 40 seconds. A Messerschmitt dove straight at her position, intending to suppress the pit entirely. The corporal beside her ducked. Carter didn't. She swept the weapon in a clean arc and released a short, brutal burst. 5 rounds hit the radiator. A burst of white vapor shot into the air. The fighter folded in on itself and fell like a dead bird. 5 kills. Kill 6. 6 hours, 22 minutes and 14 seconds. Her arms trembled from recoil fatigue, but the alignment remained perfect because she had filed it that way. A Hankel entering its bombing glide passed through her predicted intercept window. She fired. Flames erupted across the wing. The bomber clipped the tree and exploded on impact. 6 kills, 7, 6 hours, 22 minutes and 50 seconds. The last bomber in range attempted a shallow escape climb, the same maneuver Luftwaffe doctrine taught to exit low-altitude chaos. At this point, any normal AA gun would have overheated, misfed or jammed completely. Carter didn't. She leaned forward, corrected for drift, and fired a final 2-con burst. 5 rounds struck the engine cowling. Compression failed. The aircraft stalled and dropped like a stone. 7 kills, 14 minutes, and a weapon built from scrap metal had just outperformed every official AA gun on the field. 6:23 silence, not real silence. The battlefield never goes quiet, but a silence of comprehension. The base should have been burning. Hangars should have been collapsing. Runways should have been cratered. Instead, crews stared at a mechanic with soot-blackened hands and a gun that looked like it belonged in a workshop, not a war. Carter's arms shook violently from recoil, but her weapon didn't jam once, not once. A lieutenant whispered the only conclusion possible. This changes everything, and he was right. The Luftwaffe had expected North Wheel to collapse. Instead, they lost more than a quarter of their attacking wave in a single pass. The mathematics of the morning. The mathematics Germany relied on had been rewritten by a mechanic who was never supposed to touch a weapon. North survived because one person listened to metal when everyone else listened to procedure. At 7:30 a.m., the last column of smoke curled upward from the wreck of the 7th Hankel. North, expected to be a ruin of burning hangars and scattered debris, stood mostly intact. Not peaceful, not calm, but intact. And that alone was a statistical anomaly. In less than 15 minutes, a weapon no one authorized, built by a mechanic no one promoted, had delivered more kills than 3 official AA pits had managed in weeks. For a base expecting to lose dozens of men that morning, the casualty count stayed in the single digits. That wasn't luck. That was a variable the Luftwaffe had never accounted for. A gun that didn't jam. The base takes stock. 7478 Group Captain Ellison emerged from the command bunker, gripping a clipboard filled with casualty projections he no longer needed. He expected chaos, flames, structural collapse. Instead, he saw Carter standing in the pit, trembling from recoil fatigue, her face streaked with soot and the barrels of her improvised weapons still smoking. Armorers sprinted toward her, shouting questions over each other. "What is this thing? How did it fire that fast? Why didn't it jam? What did you build this with?" They weren't asking for curiosity. They were asking because their survival now depended on understanding what just saved them. At 76, an engineering officer knelt beside the spent casings. He lifted one, studied the ejection mark, then picked up another, then another. Every casing showed uniform burn patterns and perfect deformation symmetry. Data consistent not with a hand-built prototype, but with a precision machine system. He stood and spoke the sentence no one expected. "This is not improvisation. This is engineering. The Luftwaffe reacts." 7, 8. Radar reported something even more shocking. A second Luftwaffe formation already assembling for another run turned back. They didn't commit. They didn't test defenses. They didn't probe. They aborted. Analysts later concluded the reason: a base previously classified as vulnerable suddenly registered as statistically lethal. Luftwaffe tolerance for loss on a single strike was roughly 10%. They had just lost over 25% of their attacking wave in one pass. Mathematically, continuing the attack was suicide. Carter hadn't just saved North. She had altered the operational calculus of the morning. The debrief 7:15, 7:24 damage reports arrived. Fuel depot damaged, not destroyed. Hangar 2 shattered windows only. Control tower partial power failure but standing. Aircraft 9 Hurricanes still serviceable. 3 damaged beyond immediate repair. Casualties, fewer than a dozen. Under normal AA conditions, the Hankels would have dropped nearly 10 tons of ordnance across the field. Instead, 7 bombers never released their payloads because 7 bombers were no longer airborne. Ellison called Carter into the operations room. Officers parted around her, not out of respect but out of confusion. They didn't understand how North was still functioning. Ellison asked the one question that mattered: can it be reproduced? Carter didn't hesitate. With proper milling equipment, yes. With better alloys, easily. With a trained assembly crew, faster. She paused. But the alignment must be exact. 2 mm off, and it will jam like everything else. 2 mm. The margin everyone ignored. The margin that almost killed the base. Disassembly. 724,750. Ellison ordered immediate technical documentation. Engineers dismantled the weapon under Carter's supervision. What they found contradicted everything they believed about improvised weapons. Heat dispersion was more uniform than standard Lewis guns. Barrel warping was lower than expected for rapid sustained fire. Rotational collar wear was evenly distributed. Feed alignment held even under overload conditions. An engineer whispered, "How did she do this without a machining team?" Carter's answer was simple: "I listened to the metal. No one wrote that in their report. Not because it wasn't true, but because it didn't fit military language. Headquarters takes notice." 8/28/15. The Ministry of Aircraft Production telephoned the base, demanding documentation. Ellison explained, none existed. The weapon had been built in secret. The voice on the other end fell silent, then delivered the only order that made sense to bureaucrats: classify everything, begin controlled replication at once. No public acknowledgement. At 8:15, the morning log recorded the first unofficial designation: Carter, MKE. The workshop 1022. Carter was escorted to a hangar normally reserved for Merlin overhauls. Now it held drafting tables, metal stock, measuring equipment, and a crew of 6 men, mechanics who had spent the past month treating her like background noise. Now they couldn't meet her eyes. A senior fitter stepped forward and said quietly, "We'll follow your lead." Carter nodded and got to work. Her instructions were precise. Every measurement matters. Miss 2 mm and it's useless. She redrew the prototype from memory. Alignment tolerances, feed geometry, rotation, harmonics, recoil absorption, heat dissipation. The weapon that saved North Weald was no longer a secret under a tarp. It was becoming a program, a classified one, but a program nonetheless. The strategic shift afternoon, psychological operations officers interviewed gunners who witnessed the battle. They expected skepticism. Instead, they recorded something the RAF desperately needed: confidence. Gunners described the Carter Mark II as the first thing on the base that didn't flinch. They repeated the sound of its rotation like a chant. Meanwhile, Fighter Command issued a confidential notice. Evaluate rapid deployment of Carter multi-aerial system to high-risk bases in southeast England, bases like Debden, Hornchurch and Biggin Hill stations. The Luftwaffe had marked for destruction. If even a 10% reduction in bomber accuracy could be achieved, analysts estimated 100+ lives could be saved over 2 months. Carter had turned a secret experiment into a strategic variable, and the RAF now depended on the very person it refused to acknowledge. The final logic of the system, the weapon worked, the data was undeniable. The base survived, but the institution couldn't accept the story as it actually happened. Not yet. A woman, a mechanic, a self-built weapon, a flaw she discovered when official engineers didn't. A victory achieved outside the chain of command. Those truths threatened the structure more than they threatened the enemy. So the system did what systems always do. It absorbed the idea and prepared to erase the person, which leads us into the final act. The fate of the Carter Merc. The life of the woman who saved a base and the reason history almost lost her completely. By the next morning, the RAF had already begun rewriting the story, not out of malice, out of instinct. The instinct of a system that protects its structure before it protects its truth. The Carter Marai became a multi-aerial prototype. Her 3-feed offset became a novel rotational feed improvement. Her heat dispersion method became experimental thermal load balancing, and her name, the name of the person who actually built the weapon, began quietly disappearing from the paperwork. The war machine absorbed her work the way an engine absorbs fuel efficiently, impersonally, without memory. A new strategy without credit. By early September, the Carter Mark FI had already been installed at Debden, Hornchurch and Biggin Hill. Reports from those stations showed the same pattern North Weald had witnessed. Fewer bombs hitting primary assets, more bombers forced to break formation, more pilots returning home alive. Her design was making a measurable difference, but the design had a name attached to it, a name the RAF wasn't prepared to publicize in 1940. A woman, a mechanic, uncommissioned, unauthorized. Correct. So the ministry issued a directive: continue development, restrict attribution, maintain classification. Carter understood exactly what that meant. Her weapon would spread, her contribution would not. The transfer on December 12, 1940, she received her orders. A transfer to a rear area engineering depot near Wolverhampton. Official reasoning: your skills will benefit the war effort more broadly in engine production. Unofficial meaning: you've done your job. Now disappear. She read the paper 3 times, folded it once and placed it on her bunk. Not angry, not surprised. The RAF needed her ideas, but it did not need her name attached to them. At 12:27 p.m. she boarded a transport lorry with no ceremony, no commendation, no briefing, no recognition. Group Captain Ellison shook her hand before she left. What he said was simple, but it was the only sentence she remembered for the rest of her life. Not all victories are recorded in books. Some are carried only by the people they saved. She nodded, climbed into the back of the truck, and did not look back at the base she had saved. After the war, Carter never returned to weapons engineering. She joined Rolls-Royce, worked on cooling systems, vibration management, gearbox tolerances, areas where detail mattered, where precision mattered, where small errors produced large consequences. She married a flight mechanic in 1952, raised 2 children, took long walks on Sundays, never spoke about North. When asked about the war, she always said the same thing: I just fixed engines. Others did the hard part. Her children believed her, her colleagues believed her, history believed her because history had been edited to believe it. She died in 1981 at age 65 in a quiet cottage overlooking a river she loved. No medals, no citations, not a single official record connecting her to the weapon that changed the outcome of a Luftwaffe raid. For everyone except the men who survived that morning, she was a footnote written in disappearing ink. The folder in the attic, it was her son who found it. While sorting through her belongings, he discovered an unmarked folder tucked between old manuals and rusted tools. A single phrase written on the cover: August morning. Inside were the original sketches of the Carter Mark, smudged with oil, lined with pencil calculations, marked with fingerprints from nights spent filing steel under a dim work lamp. On the final page, she had written one sentence: 2 millim. That is all it takes for the world to change. No signature, no explanation, just the truth reduced to the scale it lived on. 2 M&M, a deviation the RAF missed. A correction she refused to ignore. A measurement that saved an airfield, shifted a battle and remained almost entirely erased. The real question, when you study the internal RAF memos today, when you compare Luftwaffe mission logs with casualty, projections, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The system didn't hide her because she was wrong. It hid her because she was right, and because the truth didn't fit the structure built to contain it. Carter solved a problem while the institution was still debating the definition of that problem. And history rarely records people like that. Not because they don't matter, but because systems prefer credible answers to uncomfortable truths. So the real question is not why was she forgotten. The real question is how many victories vanished the same way. Hidden in notebooks, buried in attics, measured in millimeters. If you stay for stories like this, it's because you understand something. The official records don't. Wars aren't only shaped by generals. Sometimes they're shaped by someone filing metal alone at 3 a.m., fixing a flaw no one else bothered to measure.